If you're looking for one of the best small sedans in America, look no further than the 2021 Volkswagen Jetta GLI. This is the sport version of the Jetta, and the GLI is to the Jetta as the GTI is to the Volkswagen Golf. We get a significant upgrade to the power plant under the hood, from 147 horsepower up to 228, but it's more than simply a power bump. We also get an available adaptive suspension and an available electronically controlled front differential. And at $26,345, I think the GLI is really in a sweet spot for this segment. It is more expensive than some of the least expensive sport options from Hyundai and from Kia, but we have more power under the hood. And I think this is more drivable and more livable than the Honda Civic Si, which has actually taken a year off. The GLI definitely feels like the grown-up option in this segment. LED headlights are standard, and the general styling theme of the GLI is more restrained and less boy racer than we find in a lot of the other options out there. Changes are fairly minimal to the look on the outside. We do get a slightly tweaked grille. Of course, we get this red accent strip running right through there and the GLI badge on the front, but people that are not terribly familiar with the GLI or the GTI might easily mistake this for a regular Jetta. In my mind, that's absolutely not a problem because the Jetta's restrained and elegant styling is definitely attractive. At 185.1 inches, the GLI is one of the longer compact sedans in America. This is about 3 inches longer than a Toyota Corolla, but about 7 inches shorter than the average mid-size sedan in America right now. Interestingly enough, however, you won't actually find that much more room inside a Toyota Camry. Legroom is suspiciously similar between the Jetta, because this is one of the most accommodating compact sedans in America, and that mid-size Camry. And the Camry is only going to get you 1 cubic foot of extra cargo space in the back. When you really dig into it, it seems that most of the size difference between the Jetta and the Camry is explained away by slightly longer bumper overhangs in the Camry, that 1 cubic foot of trunk space, and a hood designed to accommodate a V6 engine rather than 4-cylinder engines like we see in the Jetta. Moving to the rear, the changes for the GLI are again pretty minor. We have the GLI badge over there on that side. It doesn't say Jetta on the trunk lid. We have a very small black spoiler on top of the trunk lid, which it looks like it could be removed if you wanted this to be really discreet, and then twin exhaust tips at the bottom. Volkswagen continues to do driver assistance tech a little bit differently than some of the competition. Standard content on the GLI includes forward collision warning, blind spot monitoring, and rear cross traffic detection. Blind spot monitoring is typically optional or actually not even available in some of the competition. Optional on the GLI, which is standard on some of the competition, is radar adaptive cruise control, lane keeping, and auto high beams. It's worth noting that if you get the GLI Autobahn with the manual transmission, you still get adaptive cruise control, something that some manufacturers delete when you get a manual transmission. A really nice touch with this adaptive cruise control system is that it stays engaged even when you engage the clutch and change gears. So if you're on the highway and you need to go up and over a mountain pass, you can downshift, absolutely no problem. The system will just pick right back up after you've engaged the next gear. The big upgrade for the GLI over the base Jetta is the engine, obviously. Instead of a 1.4-liter turbo, we get a 2-liter turbo. Instead of 147 horsepower, we get 228 horsepower and 258 pound-feet of torque. As you'd expect out of a German performance vehicle, the base transmission is a manual transmission, and you can get it on the top-level trim of the GLI, which is what I'm driving today, the Autobahn version. You can also get a 7-speed dual-clutch transmission if you want to be a little bit more efficient in real-world driving, or more importantly, faster 0 to 60. Yes, faster 0 to 60, because unless you're a professional driver, the 7-speed DCT is going to be the fastest 0 to 60 GLI. However, both models get the same fuel economy, and that is a little surprising because manual transmissions often seem to go below automatics these days, and both of them will get you 28 mpg. This model also has Volkswagen's excellent limited slip front differential. It's an electronically controlled unit, so it is a little bit more intelligent than some of those aftermarket limited slips that you might want to install on some of the competition. Front seat comfort is excellent in this model. Some manufacturers force you to get manual seats if you want the sporty trim, but Volkswagen lets you have a power driver's seat with a 2-way adjustable lumbar support and a 2-position seat memory. The steering column is a manual tilt telescopic design with a decent range of motion, but the front passenger seat is still manual. As we've seen for a while, the Jetta's real claim to fame is the back seat. With this front seat comfortably adjusted for me at 6 feet tall, I have about 6 inches of legroom left. This is one of the compact sedans in America where you could put a rear-facing child seat behind a 6-foot-tall driver relatively comfortably and absolutely not have a problem with it interacting properly with the seating area. I also have a reasonable amount of headroom. If I put my head all the way back to the headrest, my head is just barely brushing the ceiling, but we have more headroom back here than we find in a lot of the smaller entries. And again, very similar legroom to something like the Toyota Camry. Now, the one area where you will notice the difference between the Jetta and the average mid-size sedan is the width of the rear bench seat. This is obviously going to be a little bit tighter, so if you do plan on mixing child seats and adults, that could be a little bit trickier. But as you can see, if I scoot all the way over to the right side of the vehicle, the footwell is a little bit tight down there, but the front seat's all the way back in its tracks, and I still have about an inch of legroom left. One distinct omission back here, however, no air vents for the rear passengers. Behind the trunk lid, we find 14.1 cubic feet of cargo space. This isn't the biggest trunk in this segment, but it is among the largest, and it's only 1 cubic foot smaller than you'll find in something like a Toyota Camry. One of the best things about the Jetta's trunk is how deep it is. I can put a 22-inch roller bag like this in an upright position and still close the trunk lid completely. You could actually line up about 4 of them right there across the back of the Jetta's cargo area, making this an awful lot more cargo practical than most of the competition, or even most mid-size sedans. So although we do see a loss of practicality versus the hatchback GTI, it's not too big. We have enough room down here to put a full-size spare tire if you wanted to aftermarket, but what comes with the vehicle is a temporary spare. Thanks to the generously sized cargo area, the spare tire, and handles to help you close the trunk lid, I'm going to give this cargo area 9 out of 10 points. As we look around the interior, keep in mind that we are in the Autobahn trim, so obviously there are going to be things in here that you don't see in the base model. We have a fairly large moonroof right over the driver and front passengers' heads. It's not one of the larger panoramic style, but you can see it goes to just past the B-pillar in the cabin. Now, the fabric shade does not completely block out the light, but I would still rather have a shade than not. The driver and front passenger get height-adjustable shoulder belts, 2-way adjustable headrests. The contrasting red stitching is just as you'd expect in a sporty trim, but just regular black seat belts. I'm surprised we don't have red seat belts available in the GLI. That is something that we're starting to see in some of the competition, even in something like the Camry TRD. As you might expect, the bolstering on the seat back and bottom cushion is more aggressive than the base Jetta, but the seats are not really narrow, so the average sized person shouldn't have any problem. Moving over to the front doors, we find a reasonable amount of hard material, as you'd expect in a mainstream compact stand. The bulk of the door panel is a hard plastic, although we do find some soft touch inserts right there in the middle, also around the armrest and the upper section of the door. The door and dash trim is imitation knurled metal, so this is actually a plastic that's been printed to look like metal. You can just barely see some of the ambient lighting right there around that door handle. Moving over to the dashboard, we find a soft touch injection molded upper section of the dashboard. Again, a large piece of that same trim right there. It's a little bit difficult to tell, but there is an ambient lighting strip running right there under that trim component. We then have a large bin-style glove compartment. I had absolutely no problem fitting a large iPad inside. In the middle of the dashboard, we find a touchscreen infotainment system. As you might expect, this supports Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. We don't have a factory mapping interface in the GLI in America at this time. We do have some auxiliary sport gauges, which is a nice touch right there. And this display is used to change a number of different vehicle features. So for instance, if I go over here to Custom and adjust the custom driving mode, this particular model has the dynamically controlled suspension system. So I can actually click that little button right there, and I have 3 different levels to choose. Now, rather unfortunately, these adjustments cannot be done while you're in motion. You would just have to adjust them when you're parked. Continuing down the dashboard, we have 2 large air vents, the controls for the dual zone automatic climate control system, 2 USB-C inputs, those both work with the infotainment system, a large Qi wireless charging mat. I had absolutely no problem fitting some of those larger smartphones in this charging area. You can see I can even fit this iPhone 12 with the charge cable still right there. So it's definitely one of those larger ones. 6-speed manual transmission shifter in this model. Reverses to the left and up. Personally, I prefer reverse over here on the right and down. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section below. It's absolutely not a deal breaker for me, just more of a personal preference, really. To the left of the shifter, we have the engine start-stop button, the electronic parking brake right there, and then the drive mode selector. We have the choice between Eco, Comfort, Normal, Sport, and Custom. We also have a button to turn off the stability and traction control over there, and then a 12-volt power port. Between the front seats, we find 2 large cup holders, and then a slot where you can store pens or other small items. Between the front seats, we find a padded armrest with more of that red contrasting stitching. This doesn't ratchet in terms of height, and it doesn't actually have a release catch there. It just opens right up to give you access to a fairly large storage compartment. I was just barely able to fit a half gallon of milk in there. One of this vehicle's best features continues to be this full LCD instrument cluster. Everything except the fuel gauge and the engine temperature gauge is being delivered by this large LCD. We're starting to see more full LCDs in this segment, but none are as configurable as this. We have several basic views to choose from. You can get one that has some dials there if you prefer a more traditional look. There's sort of a spread out look that's a little bit more modern without any sort of dial going on at all. And then we have, I guess, a slight variant of that with this particular display. Now this is running almost the same software that we see in some modern Audis, but a key difference is that there's no moving Google Map display like you'll find in those modern Audis. However, the content in each of these little areas can be adjusted individually, which is really a nice touch. So you can scroll through some options using the infotainment screen and then either get the same thing on either of those dials if you for some reason wanted to, or get different options scrolling through. Now, the one thing that is a little convoluted is that changing the options in each of those dials requires you to interact with the infotainment screen. You don't adjust it using buttons on the steering wheel. On the other hand, you can use the view button on the steering wheel to change the basic layout of the display and toggle through some of the options on that central display. You can also toggle through some of the different page options for data that you can view in that center portion using these forward-backward buttons and then the OK button in the middle. The steering wheel is one of Volkswagen's comfortable flat-bottom designs. In terms of thickness and just general design, this is sort of a Goldilocks just right, or at least right in the middle kind of design. So even though this is a little bit more thickly rimmed than you might find in some of the competition, it's not as chunky as we find in some FCA vehicles. And the sport grips are not quite as aggressive as you might find in some. I think that they're just really quite comfortable. On this side of the steering wheel, we find the controls for the adaptive cruise control system as well as volume up down. Track forward, backward are on this side, and then we have the buttons that control that multifunction LCD. Rather unfortunately, we had a little bit of a computer error which deleted the footage from this little Brady Bunch window. I guess that makes me Marcia. So let's just dive right into the numbers here. 0 to 60 happened in the Jetta GLI in 5.6 seconds if you have the DCT. If you have the manual transmission like the one I was driving this week, well, it's probably going to be 6.1 seconds like I did, or perhaps a little bit lower if you're really good at a manual transmission, or honestly a little bit higher if you're being a little bit lazy. The DCT is definitely one of the features that separates the GLI from something like the Honda Civic Si, which for some reason has never received an automated manual or an automatic transmission of any sort. With 228 horsepower under the hood, this is also a little bit more powerful than most of the competition. I love a good manual transmission, but like most GLI shoppers, I suspect I would probably get the DSG. It's an excellent transmission, and it is going to get the most out of the 228 horsepower. You'll definitely find that if you are not trying really hard, you'll probably go faster in a Jetta GLI with the 7-speed DCT than a Golf R with the manual transmission, or even a Honda Civic Type R with its manual transmission. If you want to get to 60 a little bit faster within the Volkswagen lineup, there's going to be a new Golf R coming very soon. It's also going to have an automated manual. And then if you're interested in something a little different, there's going to be an Elantra N. That is going to have an automated manual as well. It's going to have a bit more power, but not quite as much as we find in the Golf R. In my 60-0 braking test, this stopped in 108 feet, which is definitely short for this segment. You can thank the tires and the tire size for that. Simply based on acceleration numbers, you might want to include a variety of different competitors out there to something like the Volkswagen GLI, but things really start separating out when we start talking about handling. The Jetta simply handles better than something like a Mazda 3 Turbo, and you'll also notice the Jetta will stop quicker than that Mazda 3 Turbo. With the GLI, it's not just about grip levels, although those are extremely good for the Jetta GLI, it's also about the feel. Volkswagen has a really great steering feel to it. They also have a great manual transmission, to be perfectly honest. If I were shopping for a manual transmission right now, this is certainly one of my favorites. I love the 6-speed manual in the Civic, but I like the one in the Jetta GLI just a little bit better. I think the personality of the shifter, I guess for lack of a better word, just appeals to me a little bit more, but both are absolutely excellent. Some people find that the pedal position in the Civic is a little bit better than what we see in the current generation GLI, but honestly, I would take either of these manual transmissions if you're shopping for one. Handling is, again, very, very good, and we have an adaptive suspension system in the GLI, which is really a nice touch, and something that we don't find in the Elantra N-Line or the Forte GT. Those are probably the two closest competitors currently on sale at the moment because the Honda Civic Si is taking time off. We expect to see a new Civic Si in the next generation Civic coming very, very soon, but there is no 2021 model year vehicle. It's also worth noting that if you're shopping in this segment and you're debating about perhaps getting something like a Civic Type R, bear in mind that that's going to be taking a year off very soon as well. Thanks to the adaptive suspension system, the ride quality is still pretty decent, even though this is obviously more of a sporty-oriented sedan. I think that Volkswagen has done a good job trying to balance handling priorities as well as ride quality priorities, so I'm certainly going to give this a B here. Obviously, it's going to be firmer than something like a regular Jetta, but I think that the rear suspension dynamics especially are better controlled than the basic Jetta. And you'll definitely notice the difference between the GLI and something like a Mazda 3 Turbo, because the Mazda 3 Turbo doesn't have a fully independent rear suspension. And on rougher roads and broken pavement, especially in the corners, you will certainly notice that the rear end of the Mazda 3 gets a little bit unsettled, and we don't see that in the Jetta. In my cabin noise test at 50 miles an hour, we measured 72 decibels in here, making this pretty average for the mainstream compact sedan category, so I'm going to go ahead and give that a B. When it comes to fuel economy, I've been averaging 28 miles per gallon, almost exactly what the EPA says you should be getting in this vehicle. It's worth noting that if you're doing a lot of highway driving, you'll actually get better fuel economy if you choose the 7-speed DCT. According to the EPA combined numbers, we get 28 mpg in both of these trims, but the highway number is 2 miles per gallon better if you choose the 7-speed auto. The reason for that is that 7th gear in the automated manual is higher than in the 6-speed manual. That gives you better fuel economy out on the highway. Bottom line, the GLI is an awful lot of fun, and I think that Volkswagen has managed to push this into a slightly different category than the Elantra N-Line and the Forte GT. Also than the Civic Si. So I think the price tag is a little bit more justified than something like the Civic Si, to be honest, because in terms of performance, you get an awful lot closer when you get the automated manual in a Forte GT or an Elantra N-Line to the Civic Si, but the extra horsepower and the extra touches that we get on the Jetta GLI really put it into a different category. We get the limited slip front differential, which is a really nice touch. You have the automated manual, the adaptive suspension system, etc. All that together not only improves handling and performance, but it also gives the Jetta a more grown-up, more premium feel than some of the competition. For 2021, the GLI starts at $26,345, and it's a little bit of an unusual entry when we're talking about performance compact vehicles, because it is notably more expensive than something like the Forte GT, yet it's not as expensive as a Honda Civic Type R or a Subaru WRX STI. And that's because the GLI really lives in sort of a middle land between some of these different options that are available in the compact segment. $26,345 buys you the LED headlights, a standard limited slip differential. If you want the Autobahn trim, which is what we were driving this week, that's $30,745. It gets you the LCD digital cockpit, the full LCD instrument cluster, and you can get the optional dual clutch transmission for $800. I think that's a really good deal, and that will be the fastest version of the GLI. Key things to keep in mind with the GLI are that we do get the choice of manual transmission or dual clutch on both of these trims. You can get leather upholstery, the limited slip differential is standard, and then we get an adaptive suspension system if you get the top end trim. Those are some of the features that really separate it from some of the less expensive entries that you might want to be cross-shopping against. With that out of the way, let's dive right into some of these other options. The first one, obviously, that a lot of people think about is the Honda Civic Si. But the thing you need to know is that there is no 2021 Civic Si. You might still find a 2020 model year vehicle hanging out on the dealer lot, but it is taking a year off. A lot of folks are expecting it to return for 2022, although we don't exactly know if the SI version of the Civic will be available when the new Civic drops a little bit later in 2021. We also don't know how much power that new Civic Si might be giving us. The old model produced 205 horsepower and 192 pound-feet of torque from a boosted version of the same 1.5-liter turbo that we find in other Civic models. That's notably less oomph than we find in the GLI, especially on the torque front, where we get 192 pound-feet of torque versus 258 pound-feet of torque in the Volkswagen. This generation of the Civic is starting to feel definitely a little bit old. It's really obvious when you take a look at the infotainment system, the instrument cluster, etc. It just doesn't feel as modern or as premium as the Volkswagen GLI. But it does have some of the similar performance options that we find. You can get available summer tires in that if you hunt carefully. We get a limited slip differential and a 2-mode adaptive suspension system. But importantly, Honda for some reason doesn't like the thought of equipping the Civic Si or the Type R with any sort of automated transmission at all. So no automatic transmission, no dual clutch transmission, nothing along those lines. And that really has been an impediment, honestly, to the Civic Si's sales success, because they would be able to sell an awful lot more of them if more people could drive them, or more people felt like they would fit into their life. I definitely can drive a manual transmission, and I've owned and loved manual transmissions before, but at this point in my life, I probably would just buy the dual clutch transmission, especially since for most people, it's going to be faster 0 to 60. The truth of the matter is the computer can shift faster than you can, so the vast majority of drivers out there are going to be faster when they're behind the wheel of the one with the DSG. And that's why pretty much every other option in this segment offers an automated manual or an automatic transmission. Moving on to our next competitor, this one is available right now. It's the Kia Forte GT. This is sort of the bargain basement option in this segment. We get 201 horsepower, 195 pound-feet of torque, so pretty similar power figures to the ones that we find in the Civic Si for a lot less money, $22,790 base price. That is significantly less expensive than the Volkswagen GLI, and even though there are a ton of options available on your Forte GT, it's always going to be less expensive. Now, performance is also always going to be lower. 201 horsepower versus 228 horsepower and 195 pound-feet of torque versus 258. There's a reasonable power difference between that and the Volkswagen, but you will pay for that extra level of performance and extra level of refinement in the Volkswagen. When it comes to the handling ability, driving dynamics, etc., the Volkswagen GLI definitely feels like the more premium, more sporty vehicle, but it's obviously going to be also more expensive. On the other hand, the Forte does have a longer warranty. It's probably also going to cost less to keep around, and you can get a 7-speed dual-clutch transmission on that vehicle as well. The newest entry in this compact performance sedan segment is going to be the Hyundai Elantra N-Line. Now, this is where things get a little bit complicated because Hyundai is now giving us two different performance variants of the Elantra. We have the N-Line, and then we have the N without the line. The N-Line model replaces the Elantra Sport. It gets basically the same engine and transmission options that we find in the Forte GT because these two vehicles are very closely related. The Elantra N-Line is, however, a little bit more expensive at $24,100 with the manual transmission, $25,200 with the dual-clutch transmission. One of the odd things about these two vehicles is that the Elantra is less expensive with the manual, and the Forte is actually more expensive if you want the manual transmission because you have to select a number of other options in addition to the manual transmission. When you really dive into the nuts and bolts of the options in this segment, you'll notice that there aren't too many direct competitors, vehicles that have very similar price ranges and very similar power levels. Instead, we find sort of semi-steps away. So something like the Forte and the Elantra N-Line, they're below the Volkswagen GLI in terms of handling and in terms of performance. Then above the GLI, we have the Elantra N with 275 horsepower approximately and around 290 pound-feet of torque. But that is not quite at the same level as the Volkswagen Golf R, and it doesn't have all-wheel drive like you'd find in some of the higher-level performance options in this segment. On the other hand, it does have features like a limited slip differential, an adaptive suspension system, and dual-clutch transmission like we find in something along the lines of the GLI. The last thing to know about the Elantra N is that it is not on sale just yet, and we don't know exactly how much it's going to be, but I wouldn't be surprised if it ended up more expensive than the Volkswagen GLI because of its differing position. That means that, to be honest, the GLI doesn't really see any direct competition in the US. If you're looking for the most performance that you can afford in this segment, then which option is right for you will depend on your budget. If you're looking to spend $25,000 or under, clearly it's going to be the Hyundai or the Kia. If you're looking to spend $30,000 or under, it would be the Volkswagen GLI. If you're looking to spend perhaps a little bit more and you can wait for it, then it would be the Elantra N. But if you're looking to spend even more and you're willing to wait for that one, it would be the Volkswagen Golf R because that really does look hot. Be sure and let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section below, and of course, be sure and check out my first drive review of the Elantra N. I was actually able to do that a number of months ago. It is an absolutely incredible machine, but the real problem with talking about the Elantra N is that we don't have any idea how much it is going to cost. If the Elantra N costs $35,000, I would say it's a pretty decent deal. If it ends up being about the same price as the Volkswagen GLI Autobahn, then I would say it's an incredible deal. But if it ends up at $40,000, then there are probably going to be some better options out there to choose from. Be sure to let me know what you think about all that down there. Be sure and head over to the merch store, aoamerch.com, so you can buy all the latest in Alex and Auto shirts and other accessories. Find me over at facebook.com/alexandautos, and I'll see all of you next week.